we go. Great. So let's go ahead, let's jump into this. I think you all have heard in most of the lessons that we've talked about or we've gone through so far this mod, you've heard this word scope. And I think what's followed up with those words is, okay, well, we'll learn about that a little bit more later. And scope is something that I would say is important to understand, obviously, but really what we want you to kind of get from it is knowing that when you have an issue where you can't find a variable or you can't find a method, that in your head immediately you say, oh, this is a scope issue, and you're able to kind of like, you're able to go through a debugging process. It's not anything that we're expecting you to kind of like memorize, but we wanna introduce it to you a little bit more today and kind of just plant it in your mind that anytime that you get something where it's like, can't find this, don't know what you're talking about, can't find that variable, that most likely that's a scope issue. And just recognizing that it might be a scope issue helps you in that debugging process. So there's going to be a lot of little exercises that we'll do today, very tiny things. This isn't a long class. Obviously, we only have like 40 minutes left on this one. But main idea is that we want you to just get some experience being able to see what's available to a method, what's available to a class, what types of things can methods call between each other. So to start, let's go ahead and just define this word scope, short definition that I have here. So scope is what you have access to and where you have access to it. Even if you think about, like, I think about a telescope, right? Like if you're looking through a telescope and you're seeing something, you're only seeing something within that scope of the telescope. Anything that you can't see, you don't have access to. So in talking about scope today, I want to talk about 3 different scopes. And we'll use kind of local variables to help demonstrate this idea of scope and what is available where. So we'll take a look at method scope, what's available in a method, block scope, what's available in a block. When I say block, I mean something like yesterday you did introduction to each. And when you say like students.cookies.each do, everything that's between that do and the end, we call that a block. So what's available in a block. And then finally, that global space. And global space is outside of a method, outside of a class, outside of your whole application. So I want to start first by talking about that global space. And I think just to kind of draw this out a little bit too, I'm going to pull up a little whiteboard real quick and think about kind of what we have done so far. So let's say we have a file, not a great artist, so bear with me. All right, let me make this bigger. Okay, I'm gonna erase that now. Can you all see this full screen all right? Okay, thank you. All right, so we have our file. And in here, maybe we have a class, and I'm just gonna keep going with this student class idea. And our class, whenever we define our class, it has an end. And we might have methods in here. So I can just say def method 1. And that method ends with an end, right? So between the method definition and the end, this is what we would call our method scope. One thing that wasn't listed on that slide before was this idea of like class scope, what's available in the class. We mentioned block scope. So let's say, kind of going back to that example from earlier, let's say in this method 1, maybe I wanted to iterate through all of that student's cookies. So I say something like student.cookies.each do, and then you have some type of block variable here to represent what each of those elements are that you're iterating over. So it's a cookie. And then maybe I'm doing something in there, like I'm just saying like print the cookie. So print whatever that string is. So when we talk about block scope, we're talking about this here. The last one that I haven't mentioned yet in this like little horrible diagram is global scope. And global scope happens outside of the class. And there's only one global scope in an application. And you can imagine we are writing all of our code in classes. So utilizing the global scope is very rare. I would say sometimes when you might use the global scope is if you had a runner file and you're defining variables in that runner file, and then using those variables to be able to pass to classes. But anything outside of the class, so I could say like out here or here, those two little marks there, that's what I would say is your global space. Global scope, sorry. Okay, so we have like four little sections there. When we talk about scope, between those 4 types, class scope, method scope, block scope, global scope, those are the parts that we are referring to. And again, scope, meaning that whatever is defined, or when we talk about local variables and the scope of local variables are only accessible within the scope in which they are defined. So any variable that I put out here is only available to the global scope. Any variable that I put in this method 1 is only available to that method 1. Anything that I put in this block is only available to that block. There is a little kind of like exception there in that, and not necessarily exception, since your block is within a method, your block has access to methods or has access to variables that are defined in your method scope. And we'll have an example exercise where you can see that a little bit more too. Will?
Yeah. So you have where's an instance method or instance variable fall in there?
Yeah, great question. So I kind of want to focus mainly on, so an instance variable is kind of how we get around scope that comes with our local variables. And so I do want to focus on just like what's available with local variables. But as far, we have used instance variables, right? So with an instance variable is going to be defined in a method within a class. So you can think about your initialize method. You might have something here, you have @cookies, and whatever that comes out to be. And so as soon as it's defined as an instance variable, the scope of an instance variable is that it's available in any method within the class in which it was defined. So if you define that instance variable, and more often than not, you define instance variables in your initialize because then you're sure that you've hit that method the very first time that you create an object and it's been defined. So as soon as an instance variable gets defined, it's available to any method in that class in which it was defined. But instance variables are defined in classes. Or sorry, take that back. Instance variables are defined in methods. Curtis?
I guess like kind of similar. So like if it's only available in the scope in which it's defined, this is getting like really confusing. I'm like confusing myself. So like, I mean, so like when you define a method and you call it within the definition of another method, like how is that working?
Call a method, you define it. So methods are a little bit different. You can call methods, and you'll get to these. You can call methods from inside methods. Methods know about each other. But if you ever want access to a local variable, we have to pass it to that method. That's where the arguments come in. So because it doesn't know a variable from another method, you have to pass it if you want it to hold on to that information.
Okay, so I guess like then if I'm understanding you correctly, to access a variable in a narrower scope, you have to pass it in, and I guess like to access it in a broader scope, you return it out.
I'm going to say yes to that because I think you have the right idea. Like what you're thinking right now, I want you to hold on to that, but I think we can get a little bit more specific in that. Let's go ahead. Okay. Let's do some of these exercises, and maybe that's something that we can loop around and answer at the end if we still have it. Okay.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah. All right, so here's how I want to do this, or I want to run this exercise. Go, there you go. Okay. So I am going to drop a link in your channel. So let me grab a link. We'll walk through this really quick. And these should be quick. These should not take you very long to do, but I'm going to put you in groups to do them just so y'all get to meet each other a little bit and talk through this. And I think that, oops, I didn't want, well, no, let me fix that. I just want to copy this whole thing. Okay. There you go. Okay, so posted this in here. If I take a look at this link, let me pull this up. There are, in this one, 5 examples. So what I want you to do with each of these, and let me go ahead and grab all this too. Let's do this a little differently. Okay, so I'm going to paste a link to an exploration I just did for the first one. One person in your group is going to share your screen and create just like a playground file, whatever file you want, just to be able to run it so we can practice these. Copy and paste the code from each example into the playground.rb file. Take a moment to examine the code individually, then discuss with your partner what you think the outcome will be. So I'm going to grab this example, and I'm going to go over here and I'm going to touch just in whatever file I have. I'm going to touch it random file in here, and I'm just going to paste that code. And I'm going to discuss with my partner. I'm going to say, okay, what do you think is going to happen when we run ruby lib playground.rb? And I'm working with Curtis, and Curtis says that he thinks that there's going to be an error, and I say, I think it's going to be 10. And so then after we make our predictions, we're going to go ahead and we're going to run it. And we see what happens. Nothing happened. So then we go back and we see why my, oh, because I didn't save it. And Curtis was right. And so then we talk about, okay, Curtis, you thought it was going to be an error and you were right. Why was there an error for this? And we're thinking about in terms of scope, what was accessible, in this case, global scope. So this example that I just gave you, I just put into your Slack channel. This is our examples for global scope. This should only take you and your partner, I think it should only take a few minutes. What I want you to do, the last thing that's here, when your pair or group, you might be in a group of 3, is done with all exercises from this link, I just want one person from that group, just so I can kind of keep track of who's done or not, come back to the Slack message and just give me this emoji on this link, just so I know you're done and I can pull you back. Any questions on this exercise? All right. Grab breakout rooms. And I'm going to recreate them. There you go. George, did you find yours? All right. So global scope is only available to anything that is outside of a class. In this case, we don't have a class, but we do have some methods here, and we can kind of see global scope in action here. Again, this is something that you will not work with very much working in the global space, since we will be writing our code in classes. But just to go over, this was the last one. I know that not everyone was able to get through all of these. I can tell from those little emojis. But just want to go over just one example together. So we have this method here, print variable. In our global scope, we define x equals 2, and then we call this method. So we're able to call the method. We can see that method in our global scope. But when we get to that method, we define x to be 4. So it's almost like we're trying to override the variable x. Then though, after we run our print variable and we put x, we get 2. This is what I got down here. Run it again. We're getting 2. So despite what happened in our method, despite how we tried to override what x is or just assign a new value to x, still in our global scope only knows this x equals 2. So we only have access to the variables that are in our global scope when we are sitting in our global scope. Let's go ahead, let's do the same thing. I want to go ahead and drop this other set of examples. And I mentioned in your chat when I put you all in groups, a few people asked for these slides. I'll go ahead and drop those in here after I drop this link as well. So here is the link to method scope examples that I want you all to work through. Same thing on this one. You have examples 6 through 9, kind of similar. I think one actually is identical to a problem or an exercise that you did already. But I'm going to put you into groups to, again, make those predictions and run those. So let me go ahead and reopen those groups for you, and then I'll get those slides posted for you as well. Hi, Mike.
Sorry, Meg, where did you say you were going to put the slides whenever you did post them?
I just put them in your 2008 backend channel. I just put them right here.
Okay.
All right. So for these examples, you are working with your method scope. And again, local variables are local to whatever scope you define them in. So because x is defined out here, when we try to call this method and put x, when we take a look at running this again, it doesn't know what x is. It's looking for either a variable called x or a method called x. So it's only aware of what's in that method. I want to do this next part with you, which is the argument, because I think we've talked about this a little bit. But as soon as, like, if we wanted our method to know what X was from our global scope, then from our global scope, when we call that method print variable, we're going to need to pass the variable that we want that method to have access to. So in order to give access to that method, I'm going to just say here that this is, we'll just say that this is X. No, I don't want to do that because that's what this is called. No, I'll do that. Okay, X. Talking to myself happens. Print variable X. So I'm passing what was defined in my global scope to this method. Since I'm saying here that I want to pass X to this method, I need to have a spot so that this method can take in that argument or that parameter that I'm passing to it. So in here, I could call this variable passed in. Could call it whatever I wanted to. And then in order to put whatever got passed in, I need to call it by whatever I named this parameter here. So I'll just say variable passed in. So now when I do this, let's go ahead and run this. Now I'm getting 10. Okay, because I have in my global scope X equals 10. And here I want to be able to put to the screen. I want to be able to put that variable that was defined in my global scope, but I don't have access to it right now. So in order to have access to it, I need to pass it to this variable from the last time that I did have access to it. So puts X, passing X here. Now X is stored in this kind of placeholder, this argument of variable passed in, and then I can put that here. I could have also just called this X. Sometimes it gets a little confusing when we name everything the same, but that would also work. Any questions on using arguments to pass objects? Okay, the next one that I want you all to do, and I thank you for staying with me. This is getting quick and fast, and I wanna just run through these examples that I have and hopefully get you a 5-minute break before the next class. If that's all right with you all. So let me grab this for you. I skipped over the view argument scope, and I want you all to try this block examples. So we're going to skip over those original, what was it, 10 through 13. And I want you in your groups now to take a look at those block scope examples. Again, run through them, think about what's going to happen, then have one person run them and see what happens. Go ahead and open up these breakout rooms for you. Okay, I would imagine that this one might have thrown a few surprises at you all, possibly. So I copied just another example of this over here. So taking a look at this, so in our global scope right now, we have what I have highlighted here, and then also down here of printing the total. Then this in here, or I guess I should say between the do and the end, is our block scope. Okay, so we have some global scope, we also have block scope in here. When we run this, we're getting 6. So it looks like something's working here. Numbers.each do, I have this greeting of hello, so kind of like defining a new variable, but then I'm taking this total, which was defined outside of my block, and it doesn't seem to have an issue with that. and it's able to increment that with the number that we're iterating through. So within our block scope has access to whatever's in the scope above it. So in this case, the scope above it, we don't have a method that we're in right now, but the scope above this is our global scope. And so it does have access to what's in our global scope. But similar to methods, this block here, I wouldn't be able to say print greeting. So let's try this. Undefined local variable or method greeting. So blocks have access to block scope has access to what's in the scope outside of them, the immediate scope outside of them. But outside of them does not have access to what might have been defined within the block. So it's kind of like you can bring things in, but you can't pass things out. So a little tricky there. What questions do y'all have about block scope? I think this one might be one of the trickier ones. Jesse?
So if I understand correctly here, if we had defined our code block within a method, we would have had to have passed in total, because now we don't have access to total outside of the method.
Yeah, let's try it. I like that. So you're saying here, like, let's go ahead and let's just call total up numbers, and maybe in here we say print total, something like that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So I guess make a prediction what you all think is going to happen here. So we're calling total up numbers, and then in here we're calling numbers. Let's see. Undefined local variable or method number. So it errored out right away on this right here on line 5. So we would actually have to pass both of them in. We could say numbers and total if those were defined on the outside. And so down here, when we call the method, we'd have to pass numbers and total. And now let's try that. Now we get 6.
That makes sense, since both are defined outside of the method. So,
exactly.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
If we define them in the method, we could bring these down here. Then we wouldn't need this here, and we could just call the method.
Okay, great, thanks.
Yep. Any other questions on that block scope? Okay. Again, it's okay if this is feeling like a little fuzzier or a little bit much right now. That's totally normal. And again, the main purpose of this is just so that you all see this error of like undefined variable, undefined method, and you know kind of where to look, where to start debugging. I want to go back just to this first example that we had, which was x equals 10, puts x, puts y. That error that we got when we ran this was undefined local variable or method y. The lookup for variables and the lookup for methods are very similar in Ruby. So when we run this, it knows to either look up a variable called y or a method called y, but it couldn't find either. So that's why we got that error. So let's say we wanted to make a method for y. And so let's make a method called y, right? We're saying puts y, so we'll say let's make a method for y. And in here, let's just go ahead and say that the return value of this is going to be 20. Let's see what we get now. So we got that printed out 10, and then we have that printed out 20. So puts x, it printed out 10, and then puts y, it called the method, and the method's return value was this 20. Let's say, I'm going to pull up another example from the lesson plan too. And getting to this idea of like methods we know are able to call other methods. We've seen that in action before. Not something we've really had yet in these exercises. But let's say I had this here, a method called print variable and a method called y. And I call print variable. So right now, go ahead and think to yourself, what's going to happen when I run this? what is going to be the return of this file? And let's go ahead and run it. And we get this 20 back. So kind of walking through this, we call print variable. Print variable, it's going to look up, is there a variable called print variable, or is there a method called print variable? It finds a method called print variable. And then it goes into here, which says puts y. And so now Ruby's saying, okay, well, is there a variable called y? No. Okay, well, is there a method called y? And methods have access to other methods. So it's looking outside of the scope of this method to find a method called y. And it was able to print out 20. This is kind of like, we can kind of see the difference now between defining a local variable outside of a method and defining another method. If I had this as y equals 20, now when I call print variable and it says puts y, it's going to say, is there a local variable? No. Is there a method? No. And so now when I run this, now it's having an issue with y. So from a method, you don't have access to a variable defined outside that method, but you do have access to other methods. Okay. And the same thing goes if I were to have a class. So let's say I have this class here of a person class. They have a greeting method and a name method. So down here on line 11, I'm saying this person, let's create a new person object. This is all in our global scope right here, and save it into this variable person. And I want to put to the screen person.greeting. So person.greeting, I can call .greeting because it's off of a person object. I can get to it right here. And in this string, it's saying, hello, my name is name. And that name is first going to say, okay, well, I don't know what name is. Is name a local variable? No, I don't see it anywhere in this method. Okay, well, is it a method? Yes, I see it outside here within my class. I'm able to talk to that method. So let's go ahead and run this. And we do get, hello, my name is Bob Ross. If I tried calling that method outside here and just say, well, puts greeting. Greeting is only accessible from a person object, off of a person object. So right now, if I try to just put whatever the greeting is to the screen, undefined local variable or method greeting. So in our global scope, it's saying, is there a local variable in my global scope? It's only looking outside of that. No. Is there a method called greeting in my global scope? No. Okay, so that's why it had an issue being able to call greeting from within a person class. Questions? Curtis.
So just to check my understanding, if
Yeah.
there's like ambiguity, like in one of the examples, there was a number method and a number like block variable. Ruby like has the block variable take precedence over the method?
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
Like if you had a variable out here equals something, and then you said like numbers dot each do, this was called number. Is that kind of what you're saying, Curtis?
The one outside was like a method, not a variable.
Okay, but it was named the same.
Yes.
Yeah. So the order precedence would be it would use this block variable before it went out to look for another variable elsewhere. Good question.
Cool. Thank you.
Yeah. Any other questions on this right now? Sean?
Yeah, if I may just ask Connor's question, do you know of any kind of acronym that would, keep you remembering this order of precedence?
Ooh. I do not know an acronym at this point, but if y'all come up with one, let me know. No,
All right, thanks.
I don't know one right now. Sorry, Sean. All right, y'all. let's go ahead. Let's go ahead and take 5 minutes. Let's take 6 minutes. 6 minutes. Can you all come back at 11? Oh, what is it right now? 58. So let's come back at 11:05 actually. So we get a little bit extra time there. And Mike, is that all right with you? You'll start your class at 11:05?
Yep. Just can you pass me host?
Yep. All right. We'll see you all then.
You can also stop recording now.
Yes, that's what I'm doing. Thanks, Mike.